Richard and Margaret were an elderly couple living in a quiet neighborhood in Chicago. Their home, once filled with laughter, music, and conversations, had become a place of silence and memories. More than 10 years earlier, they had lost their only son, Michael, in what was said to be a tragic warehouse fire on the outskirts of the city. Since then, life never truly returned to normal. They learned to wake up, to eat, to breathe, but they never really learned to live again. Michael had always loved cars, engines, and the feeling of freedom on the road. He was lively, kind, and had a way of turning every day into something exciting. But in the months before his disappearance, something in him had changed. He became quieter, distracted, constantly looking over his shoulder, as if carrying a burden he could not share. When the fire happened, the authorities closed the case quickly, saying there was nothing suspicious. Richard tried to accept it, Margaret held on to faith, but deep inside, both carried the same silent question: was this really the full truth? Time passed slowly. Holidays lost their meaning. Birthdays were no longer celebrations, just reminders of absence. Their life became routine, and memories were the only thing that kept Michael close. Until one ordinary afternoon, everything shifted. Richard received a phone call from an old friend who worked with insurance auctions. He mentioned that in a storage facility near Detroit, several seized and forgotten items were being listed for sale, and among them was a sports car matching Michael's car in every detail. The same model, the same color, the same unique scratch on the side that Michael had gotten years earlier after swerving to avoid a dog on the road. When Richard repeated this to Margaret, her breath stopped. Her eyes filled instantly. That mark wasn't coincidence. It was part of their son's story. If the car was still out there, why had it been hidden? Who had kept it? And why was it appearing only now? Even though fear tried to stop them, the need to know the truth spoke louder. Richard gathered what savings they had left for emergencies. Margaret packed a small bag, and without needing to say it aloud, both understood they weren't just going to see a car. They were walking toward a past that never properly ended. The road to Detroit felt longer than it really was. Every mile carried memories. Michael laughing behind the steering wheel, talking about dreams, promising the world ahead was his to conquer. When they finally arrived at the storage lot, the environment felt cold, businesslike, emotionless. But inside their hearts, everything was loud, painful, trembling. When the tarp was lifted from the car, Margaret covered her mouth to hold back a sob. Richard had to steady himself against a wall. It wasn't just similar. It wasn't a coincidence. It was Michael's car. And surprisingly, it wasn't neglected. It wasn't dusty or destroyed. It looked preserved, cleaned, maintained, almost as if someone had been protecting it instead of discarding it. In that moment, something changed inside both of them. The grief that had stayed silent for years transformed into something new, determination, a quiet but powerful certainty that the story they had been forced to accept might not be the real one. Richard looked at Margaret, and without needing a single word, they knew they couldn't simply walk away. If the car had survived, then maybe the truth had survived too. And for the first time in many years, instead of only mourning, they felt something different rising within them, the strength to search, to question, to confront what had been buried for so long. That day, without realizing it, their lives stopped being only about loss and became a journey toward answers that could change everything. Richard knew one thing the moment he saw that car. He could not let it disappear again. Even with limited savings, he entered the auction with determination. Margaret stood beside him, trembling, holding onto his arm as if holding onto the last piece of hope they had left. For everyone else in that warehouse, the car was simply an object of value. For them, it was the final link to their son. After tense minutes, raised paddles, nervous glances, and pounding hearts, They won. Margaret signed the papers with tears running silently down her face. It felt like they were not just buying a car, they were reopening a life. Back in Chicago, Richard parked it in their old garage. He stood in front of it for a long time, just staring, the same way he used to watch Michael, proudly showing off every small change he made. But something about the car struck him deeply. It wasn't abandoned, it wasn't damaged, it was cared for, clean, preserved. Someone had taken time to keep it alive. That meant purpose, that meant intention. Margaret watched from the doorway, feeling the same truth forming in her chest. This car hadn't survived by accident. Richard began checking every corner, every compartment. Inside, they found things that didn't belong to an abandoned vehicle. Personal belongings carefully hidden, old photographs, a worn jacket Michael loved, and beneath the lining of the trunk, taped tightly in place, a small metal box. Richard's hands shook as he opened it. Inside was a notebook filled with Michael's handwriting. Not casual notes, not random thoughts. Confessions, warnings, fear. Michael wrote about powerful people, hidden deals, things happening behind closed doors. He mentioned names that carried influence. He spoke about corruption disguised as respectability. And most of all, he wrote about danger, real danger, the kind you don't accidentally stumble into, the kind that hunts you. The final pages stopped abruptly, as if he'd been interrupted mid-thought. For Richard, it was like losing him all over again. For Margaret, it was like someone tearing open a wound that had never healed. There were also photographs tucked between the pages. Michael smiling beside a young woman in front of a small bookstore cafe in Seattle. On the back of one photo, her name was written softly, Emily. In the notebook, Michael mentioned her with tenderness, plans, future, love, and above all, his desire to protect her from everything he was entangled in. If anyone still held pieces of the story, if anyone knew what he was truly facing, it was her. After a long, emotional conversation, Richard and Margaret understood something clearly. They had survived years of silence, but they could no longer survive ignorance. They needed answers, not rumors, not official conclusions, truth. So, despite their age, despite their fear, they made a decision. They would travel to Seattle and find Emily. The journey wasn't easy, not physically, not emotionally. Every mile reminded them of the life they almost accepted as closed. When they finally reached the small cafe bookstore, Margaret heard her heart racing faster than it had in years. They entered quietly, and there she was. Emily looked older than the girl in the photographs, not aged by time, but by grief and exhaustion. When she heard Michael's name, she froze. For a moment, she tried to protect herself, to keep that past buried. But when Margaret gently placed the notebook and photographs on the table, Emily's strength collapsed. Tears fell, and so did years of silence. She confessed that she had never believed the official story. She knew Michael was afraid in those final weeks. She remembered his words, his unfinished promises, his constant tension. He had told her that if something ever happened to him, it wouldn't be an accident, and he had begged her to stay quiet, to live, to stay safe. Then she revealed something that made Richard lose his breath, and Margaret gripped the edge of the table to stay upright. Michael had not left the world completely. He had left something far greater than memory. He had left a child, a living legacy, a little boy who had grown up without ever knowing his father, without knowing the truth behind his absence. In that moment, Richard and Margaret felt their hearts shatter and awaken at the same time, because now their mission was no longer just about understanding the past. It was also about protecting the future. The revelation struck them deeper than anything before. Michael had a child, A little boy around 9 years old who had grown up never knowing his grandparents, never knowing the real story of his father, never knowing how much love he had been denied. Richard felt his chest tighten, as if the air had been punched out of him. Margaret covered her face with shaking hands, tears flowing silently, not just from sadness, but from a strange, aching joy. Their son had left something behind, a life, a future, a piece of him still breathing in this world. Emily explained that she discovered her pregnancy shortly after Michael disappeared. Shocked, grieving, and terrified by everything he had warned her about, she made a painful decision. She would protect that child at all costs. She raised him quietly, away from attention, never speaking too much about the past, always careful, always alert. But living like that for years had taken its toll. The fear never truly faded. It just stayed silent, lurking in the background of every day. Then she showed them a picture of the boy. Dark hair, bright eyes, a smile that looked exactly like Michael's when he was little. For Margaret, it was like looking at a miracle she never imagined she would see. For Richard, it was like seeing Michael's childhood return for a brief second. But alongside love came another feeling: dread. If Michael had been hunted because of what he knew, what kind of danger surrounded this innocent child? Richard asked gently if Michael had left anything else behind, a clue, a sign, something that could help them understand exactly what had happened. Emily hesitated, then took a slow breath and revealed what she had carried alone for years. On the night Michael disappeared, someone had slipped an envelope under her back door. Inside was a key, a small scrap of fabric stained with dried blood, and a piece of paper with a short warning and an address. She never took it to the police. Michael had told her not to trust them. He had been clear. Some of the people meant to protect were part of the problem. Margaret felt a shiver travel through her body. Richard clenched his jaw. They had not only lost their son, they had been surrounded by lies. And worse, the threat wasn't gone. It was still there, still watching. Emily hesitated before saying something else. Over the past weeks, she had noticed a dark car repeatedly driving past her street, slowing down, waiting, leaving, returning on different days. At first, she tried to dismiss it as coincidence, but deep down, she knew better. Fear does not imagine that kind of detail. Fear recognizes danger. The room grew quiet, heavy, suffocating. Richard's fists tightened unconsciously. Margaret felt both terror and resolve rising within her. They had been silent victims long enough. Whoever had destroyed Michael's life was still out there, still moving, still powerful. And now they were not only threatening memories, they were threatening Michael's son. Emily wiped her tears and looked at them with surprising strength. She had lived hiding long enough. She didn't want to run anymore. She told them she was willing to help uncover the truth, but they had to be careful. This wasn't a fight against ordinary people. This was a fight against influence, money, and connections, against individuals who believed they could rewrite reality simply because they controlled it. Richard felt something awaken inside him, not anger alone, purpose. For years he had lived broken, surviving day by day under the shadow of grief. Now, standing for his son meant standing for his grandson. Margaret saw that determination in his eyes and understood instantly. From that moment, there was no going back. Silence would no longer protect them. Action might. But life didn't give them much time to plan. The very next day, a shocking piece of news spread through the media. A respected former federal officer, a man praised publicly but whispered about in darker conversations, had been hospitalized in critical condition. And what made Richard and Margaret stop in their tracks wasn't just his name. It was the message he had sent from his hospital bed. He wanted to see them, not lawyers, not reporters, them, before it was too late. The news felt unreal. The very man whose name appeared repeatedly in Michael's notebook, a powerful former federal officer, admired in public but feared in private, was in critical condition at the hospital, and he had asked specifically for Richard and Margaret, not the authorities, not the press, them. He claimed he needed to clear his conscience before the end. It sounded dangerous, suspicious, but it was also the only chance to finally hear the truth straight from the source. After a sleepless night, they made their decision. Emily stayed in Seattle with the boy, protecting him like a shield, aware that her silence was no longer just fear, but strength. Richard and Margaret traveled to the hospital with heavy hearts. The corridors were quiet, filled with the smell of disinfectant and the quiet tension of life balancing between hope and farewell. Every step echoed with memories of Michael, the child he had been, the man he tried to become, the life that had been taken. When they entered the room, the man in the bed looked nothing like the powerful figure he once was. Age, illness, and guilt had stripped him down to something painfully human. He looked at them, and instead of arrogance, there was regret. Instead of denial, there was surrender. With a fragile voice, he confirmed what they already feared. Michael had not died in an accident. He had been targeted. He had uncovered a dangerous network of corruption, illegal deals, and authority used to protect criminals rather than stop them. And when he tried to do the right thing, they silenced him. The man admitted he was responsible for authorizing the actions that led to Michael's death. The fire had been staged. Evidence had been hidden. The truth was buried because too many powerful names were involved. But as the years passed and his life approached its end, the weight of what he had done became unbearable. He had kept records, names, places, proof, and now he gave everything to Richard and Margaret. Margaret cried, but this time her tears were different, not only grief, but clarity. Richard didn't explode in anger. He listened. He absorbed every word. He didn't want revenge. He wanted justice. He wanted Michael to be remembered not as a tragedy, but as a good man who tried to stand against something far bigger than himself. With that evidence, they reached out to a determined federal attorney known for fighting powerful cases. Unlike the past, this time they found someone willing to listen. An investigation began quietly, carefully. Old files resurfaced, buried truths returned to light. One by one, the pieces formed the story Michael had died trying to reveal. Meanwhile, life slowly began to breathe again. Emily felt lighter knowing the truth was finally moving forward. The boy continued living his childhood, unaware of the storm that had surrounded his existence, but slowly stepping into a future being cleaned of shadows. One peaceful afternoon, Richard finally hugged his grandson for the first time. It was awkward, emotional, overflowing with love that had waited years to exist. Margaret stood beside them, finally feeling something close to peace. In time, justice came. Some of the people involved faced prison. Others lost the power they once abused. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't quick, but it was real. And that was enough to lift a weight off Richard and Margaret's hearts. They didn't get Michael back. No justice in the world could ever give them that. But they reclaimed his truth, his dignity, his story. Their home no longer felt like a museum of grief. Laughter returned, warmth returned, and every time Richard looked at Michael's car, he no longer saw tragedy. He saw courage. He saw love. He saw a legacy that lived through a child who would grow up with truth instead of silence. This story reminds us that truth may be delayed, but it does not disappear. It hides, it waits, but sooner or later it rises. And now I ask you, in their place, what would you have done? Remain silent to survive, or fight for justice no matter the cost? If this story touched you, share your thoughts in the comments and stay with us for more powerful stories like this. Your presence here truly matters.